Welcome to this wonderful program we have today, which I am really looking forward to. All of you know Sanjeev Sanyal. I am not going to introduce him as the principal economic advisor. I am going to introduce him as an Indian who is deeply interested in making sure that the history of India is restored to the factual position as we understand it today, from the fact that it has been written by so many people who wanted to represent it in a manner that suited them best. Along with him, we have Chennai's own, Chennai's pride, Sriram, whose deep understanding of Chennai's business history especially, and many other aspects of Chennai, we have been regaled to and I would say edified with over the past several years. So thank you, Sriram, and thank you so much, Sanjeev, for coming here. Originally, the subject was putting India into the Indian Ocean, but now it has become even more energized and even more exciting, and I think I am not going to tell you what it's going to be, because I myself am going to discover along with you this evening how rethinking Indian history can happen. So thank you, and over to Sanjeev and over to Sriram.
Thank you, Gopal. Sanjeev and I met this afternoon, and we worked out a format where he would like to first speak to the audience for 10 minutes or so, and then we get on to the question answer format. So it's now over to you, Sanjeev.
Thank you very much, and let me begin first by thanking the organizers and Madras School of Economics for hosting me. I suppose in some ways this is quite the right venue for this. You have a economist speaking on history in a institution supposedly dedicated to the study of economics, but clearly hosting events for a wide variety of subjects, including history. So this is the right place to rethink Indian history in some ways. So what I thought is, I'll give you some flavor of my own sort of way of thinking about this issue of rewriting and rethinking Indian history. It keeps popping up in our national debate, and usually it pops up as largely a political debate. But in fact, there are some somewhat more profound reasons why we should pay some attention to this matter. Because as I often repeat a African proverb which goes as follows, that as long as the lions do not have their storytellers, the history of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. Now, so unless we write our own history, there is a chance that unfortunately how we define ourselves, how we think of ourselves will be defined by somebody else. It's not that we will live in a vacuum, it's just that somebody else's definition of it will define us. Now, there are several reasons why we need to rethink Indian history. But surely the first point of starting on this is simply this, that most of the history that we read in our textbooks is not Indian history at all, but is the history of Delhi. And so you are likely to be taught about obscure dynasties like the Lodhis, which probably ruled over a kingdom which wasn't too much bigger than Greater Chennai, or even learn about, the last Mughal emperor, Bahadur Shah Zafar, whose kingdom basically was the Red Fort. And the Mughal Empire by his time had ceased to exist for something like 100 years. And he was a pensioner of the British, and in fact was largely irrelevant even to the 1987 revolt. And yet we learn about his life. And we wouldn't learn about large chunks of Indian history at all. So if you don't happen to be from this part of the world, you probably have never heard of the Pallavas and the Cholas and so on. But while the Tamils do make a big fuss about this matter, let me tell you that you are not the worst affected by this. You can go through life and without having ever heard of anything of the history of the Northeast, for example. And yet the Northeast has a very colorful history. You have, for example, the Ahom kingdom, which lasted for something like 600 years. And not only that, they can proudly claim to have beaten up everybody who invaded them, including the Mughals at their height. So, you know, there was an Ahom general called Lasit Borphukon who enticed Aurangzeb's army into a naval battle on the Brahmaputra and sank the fleet. This was before Shivaji and many of the others and the Sikhs who ultimately would go on to defeat the Mughals. But the point I'm making to you is that the Northeast has all kinds of contributions to Indian history. And in fact, I was once conversing with a Manipuri gentleman, and even they very often don't even know their own history, whereas it's actually a very interesting history. You see, there's a very good reason why we were invaded always from the west and not from the east. It's not because people didn't attempt to invade us from the east. In fact, the Burmese tried very hard. And we can thank our stars that it was the Manipuri who held our eastern border and the Ahoms, and despite extreme odds, beat back the Myanmarese repeatedly. So that is the reason, by the way, we were invaded from the northeast and not the, from the northwest and not the northeast. It's because of some groups of people, particularly the Manipuri and their extraordinary resistance to foreign invasions. Now, this is not at all taught in our history books. In fact, the Manipuri were also the last to be ultimately subdued by the British in the very end of the 19th century. So, if there is a martial race in the country, it happens to be the Manipuri, and nobody ever knows about this. But believe me, don't pick a fight with the Manipuri women. I think Mary Kom has more or less proved that. In fact, married to an Assamese lady also, don't pick a fight with them either. Now, there is also, of course, large parts, other parts of the country which have, I mean, how much do you know about Gujarati history? Did you know that, although we hear about the sacking of Somnath, but the first time around that Mahmud Ghazni turned up, he was actually beaten and thrown back by the Solankis. How much do we know the history of Kashmir or the history of the Vijayanagar Empire? Large parts of these histories have simply been wiped out of our memory. And this is not just, I'm talking about ancient history. Even more recent histories have been wiped out of our memory. And I will come back to that a little bit later. The second big reason why we need to revisit our history is because history is not just a series of dynasties and kings. That's political history, but there are many other ways of thinking of history. Something that I like doing is to think about history in geographical terms. So you can think of Indian history in terms of how our climate changed, how our wildlife has changed, how our rivers have changed, how our cities have risen and fallen over thousands of years. That's a completely different history. It will still involve some kings and dynasties and so on, but they are in the background. Something else happens in the foreground. Or you can think of Indian history in terms of the history of Indian science. And there's actually lots to be said about the history of Indian science. And sadly, again, political debate tends to capture this and take it away. But you know, one doesn't have to believe in Vedic flying chariots in order to be proud of the achievements of Indian science. I mean, it is a fact that Indians invented plastic surgery. In fact, many kinds of surgery. It is a documented fact that the Europeans learned it from Indians in the early 19th century. There is, of course, a large amount to be said about mathematics and metallurgy that were invented or discovered in India, and so on. So much of this needs to be documented and properly taught and written about. Unfortunately, what has happened is that you have now been left with two camps one group will deny anything that great that Indians did in the ancient times, and another which will claim that everything happened in Indian times, you know, quantum physics is Indian. The light was and Indians were visiting Mars in ancient times, and just about anything. So it doesn't help the case. What you need is evidence, and there is plenty of evidence which needs to be. First of all, some of it just needs to be systematized. Actually, I mean, some of it is even researched. We just need to write about it properly and tell the story. But there are literally tens of thousands of Sanskrit and non-Sanskritic texts as well, which are simply lying around, haven't been translated. So I think that is so there is this whole issue of the non-political history of India as well that we need to think about. Then there is the problem of rooting out of our thinking the biases that have accumulated over the last couple of 100 years. Now, the biggest part of it is, of course, the business of colonial history. Now, notice when you read your textbooks or even read mainstream histories, how in every war the Indians always lose. Now, the fact is, we must have won some wars at least since we are still here. But they have been simply edited out, and it's been done deliberately. That is what is fascinating about this. That it is not like it just turned out that way, it was deliberately done by somebody. So, for example, you will get the impression that the British conquered India from the Mughals. But they didn't. They conquered it from the Marathas. The Marathas ruled an empire which went all the way from Punjab, in fact reached as far as Attock at one stage, all the way down here, right next door, Tanjavur, right, that's where they ruled. This was an empire that was larger than that of Akbar. And it, at its height, lasted for some 75 odd years. Now that is longer, incidentally, than we have been a republic. So it's not a short period of time. And yet, this has been edited out entirely. Wellington, who defeated Napoleon, says in his memoirs that the most difficult battle he fought was not against Napoleon, but against the Marathas at Asai. And so this was a major event. And in fact, the revolt of 1857 was really a revolt to a very large extent of the remaining Marathas against British rule. So the point I'm making is, the Marathas were an important bunch of people, yet we learn nothing about them, and it's not ancient history. I'm talking about recent history. But if you go back even further in history, you'll have repeatedly see the same pattern. So you will hear about the 3 battles of Panipat, but you won't hear about the Battle of Bahraich, where there was a small kingdom near what is now Ayodhya, Faizabad area, where a local king called Suhail Deo Pasi dramatically defeated the nephew of Mahmud of Ghazni in 1033 AD. And it was such a devastating defeat that the Turks didn't come back for 150 years. That is the difference between Mahmud and Ghazni and the Mahmud of Ghori. It's a 150-year gap, and yet our textbooks will give you the impression that one bunch came and a few years later another bunch came. That's not the case. 1.5 centuries passed, and this is the reason. Similarly, unless you happen to be from Kerala, you probably know very little about Martanda Varma. And yet, Martanda Varma is not just an important person in Indian history. He is an important person in world history, because in the early 18th century, the most powerful global multinational force were the Dutch East India Company. And the Dutch East India Company controlled at that time what is now Indonesia, Sri Lanka, South Africa, and it looked like it was going to slowly begin to creep and take over India. And at the height of their power, in the early 1730s, Martanda Varma took them on and defeated them crushingly at a place called Kolachada. And as a result of which, I am giving this lecture to you in English, not in Dutch. And after Martanda Varma, the next time an Asian power defeated a European power was in 1905, when the Russians were defeated by the Japanese. Everywhere in the world you will learn about the Japanese victory over the Russians. Even Indian textbooks will tell you about it. But nobody will tell you about Martanda Varma, who is almost forgotten. In fact, when I was researching one of my books, I think The Ocean of Churn, I had driven down the Kerala coast and up Tamil coast, and I had visited Kolachar. And I was shocked to find that there is a Vijay Stambh, which had been put up by Martanda Varma to commemorate his victory. And literally, it was in a garbage dump. There were broken urinal next to it. I'm glad to say that it has, a year or two ago, it was cleaned up, and the Madras regiment is now looking after it, thankfully. By the way, it's still the Madras regiment, not the Chennai regiment. And it's interesting why they did it as well. One of the battalions of the Madras regiment is a direct descendant of a battalion that fought for Martanda Varma in that battle. So that was the reason they did it. Anyway, the point is that much of this history is lying around. We ourselves don't care about it, and we care about what Cunningham said, what Prinsep said. And we have allowed ourselves to be taken in so much that we perpetuate many of these lies. So we will read about one of India's greatest generals, Samudragupta. And we are told that he was the Napoleon of India. Why the Napoleon of India? Why not the Julius Caesar of India? Or why not the Patton of India? Or the Eisenhower of India? Many other words can, these people at least came in recent times. Why not many other, Peter the Great of India or Chengiz Khan of India? Anything could be. Why Napoleon? Well, the reason the British wanted to make sure it was Napoleon is because they themselves had beaten Napoleon. And the messaging that they are trying to give you is that maybe Samudragupta was a great general, but even your greatest general we could have beaten. And this is done subliminally, continuously. So you'll hear Chanakya was the Machiavelli of India. Right? Now Machiavelli was a small-time advisor to a tiny kingdom in Florence. Okay, Chanakya was one of the greatest, not just philosophers, but empire builders of his time. In fact, of world history. The empire that he founded would go on to become the largest and most populous empire in ancient times. So he's not a small-time operator. And yet, you see, very cleverly you have equated the two. Now, we are 70 years after independence. What is interesting is that we keep perpetuating this. Instead, we are very, very happy that Samudragupta has been equated by some European. So this is a major, major problem. But instead of clearing up these cobwebs in our history and developing our own understanding of our history after independence, what we did is add on top of it Nehruvian and then Marxist and other biases to an extent that the original evidence is now lost. And we have just built a bunch of lies, built another bunch of lies, and built another bunch of lies, and we really need to revisit this whole thing. Now, two things before I stop. One is, when this rewriting happens, we must pay attention to evidence. Because if we don't pay attention to evidence, we will have this silly thing, conversations about how everything in the world came from Vedic civilization or it came from Lemuria. So this has cannot be the basis of a debate. It has got to be based on evidence. Secondly, while there are many great things to be proud about India and Indians, we have to learn to appreciate the fact that whatever India was, even in ancient times, it was an evolving civilization. There is no sort of great Garden of Eden, pure Indian civilization. There wasn't one in the north, and there wasn't one in the south. There is also no pure Tamil civilization either. All of this is based on interactions internally and externally. And this has been true right from the very beginning of Indian history. So this history that we have has got to be seen in terms, is not a search for some pristine past, but an understanding of ourselves as a civilization that has both imparted a great amount of things to the rest of the world, but has also imbibed many things for the rest of the world. And that interaction has been both good and bad, depending on the time. Occasionally, both good and bad at the same time. And so, with that, let me hand it back.
I was reminded of what Ambedkar said. imposing an endogamous law on an exogamous society.
Yes.
And that is what we've succeeded doing
Yes.
over so many years. And I
Yes.
think that's quoted in your book.
Yes, that's right.
From economics to history.
I think you need to place this a bit towards yourself.
From economics to history, what what made you take that journey?
Well, I think it's got a lot to do with what I think is happening in this institution as well. Is a recognition that, look, while for learning purposes we can silo the world just because it's convenient for teaching and reading or writing, the world we actually live in is not functioning in silos. History affects geography, geography affects economics, economics affects history, which affects society, which affects culture, which affects religion, which affects all kinds of things. So the point is, we live in what I prefer to call as a complex adaptive world, where all kinds of different influences are influencing each other continuously in all kinds of, what should I say, sometimes in unintended ways. There are full of butterfly effects, there are unintended consequences, and it's a, so this is a, if that is the world we live in, and incidentally it's a way of thinking that I bring not just to my history writing but also to the way I think about designing cities or about in my economics as well. The point is, while you can take a certain lens for convenience for thinking about something, world itself is mixed up. So when I'm writing history, I'm writing history, but it's not that I've stopped being an economist. And when I write economics, I've not stopped being a historian. Or if you read my books, in fact, you'll find lots of urban design stuff also filtered through. So lots of my urban design stuff also comes through. You will see my interest in genetics sometimes pop up. So I like to mix and match, and I think much of knowledge has unfortunately become very reductionist. It's all become about, you know, the world is seen as if that the parts add up to the whole, but in fact, in reality, the whole is much more than the sum of the parts. And that's basically what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to break those silos.
I must remember this answer, because when they asked me what made you shift from engineering to history, the only answer I've given is I found engineering very boring in comparison. But now this is a much better answer to give.
I did that too, till I came up with the more profound answer.
When did you feel this desire to start, writing? And the first book was about the Indian Renaissance, if I remember.
Yes,
right?
it's a more an economics-oriented book.
Exactly. But when did you have this desire to move?
See, I have been interested in various things from a long time. My interest in history, ironically, comes from Amar Chitra Katha, not my textbook.
All of us.
So, but I've always sort of been kind of free-flowing in the way I've done things. I ended up basically in economics entirely by chance. I ended up studying more economics also by chance. There was a scholarship that paid me to go to Oxford, so I ended up studying more. Otherwise, I would have ended up doing something else. So I have always had a free-flowing view of my life and of the world. So yeah, so that's basically how I ended up doing various things.
You know, the first book that I read of yours was The Land of the Seven Rivers, and I read it the year it was released. I think that was 2012, if I'm not mistaken. And what I really found fascinating about this book was the way it traced the geography and then brought in history as well. So, it completely, to a lot of us who had studied the textbooks, as you put it, and all of it was the history of dynasties. This brought in a very, very different perspective. How did you hit upon this idea of, taking on geography and then tracing the history of India through that as a process?
Well, anybody who knows anything about my politics knows that I'm very suspicious of dynasties. So that was a good starting point. But look, you can start from any side. You could have written about geography from the perspective of history, because the point I'm trying to make is, I'm always very suspicious of anybody who has a unidimensional explanation of the world. So I'm suspicious of anybody who also says history determines, geography determines history. I would be suspicious of anybody who would say demographics is destiny. That's why I'm suspicious of Marxists, because they have a unidimensional dialectic process that is the explanation of everything. So the point I'm trying to make through all my writings, not just here, is that the world is fundamentally cannot be understood by any deterministic unidimensional worldview. It does not matter which one it is. One lens cannot be used to understand the world, period. Now, once you've understood that, then you will see that in all my writings, my columns are not history, they're other things. I do this. So here what I've done is, okay, I took the lens of geography to write about history. I could have taken some other lens, it just happened to be this one. And the reason it came together in some ways is again one of the random things I did in life. As you know, I'm an economist, but I used to work in financial markets. And as it happened to be in 2008, one fine morning, I was living in Singapore. I decided to get up and resign for no particular reason, and then called up my wife and said, you know what, let's move back to India. She was not entirely pleased by this sudden announcement. But anyway, we moved back to India in the end of 2008, and we traveled around with my kids for 2 years. We based ourselves in Gurgaon because we had to send them to school somewhere, but we really traveled around all over the place. So in some ways, much of what I wrote, what I found, sort of came together into this book. So you'll find a lot about Delhi in this book and the evolution of Delhi. It happened to be that I was in Delhi. If I happened to be in Chennai, it would have been written as the history more of Chennai. It was just the way it turned out.
The you've spoken about this unidimensional one lens, but what I found, between this and this one, is that we've all been taught that the Emperor Ashoka was great. Now, in book one, Emperor Ashoka is great. He is still great. But here he is Ashoka, the not so great. What made you change in your view? And when I read about it, it was very convincing, mind you, that I did really come to the conclusion, yes, this was a man who was human like all of us. He was not a Superman. But what made you change?
So I'm glad you noticed this, because this is part of what I am, my own evolution. The point I keep making, it has got to be based on evidence. I, like everybody, had gone with the conventional evidence that he was a good king. That's what I've been led to believe. So since I had not specifically researched him very deeply in the first book, so I went along with the general conventional view that he must have been a good king. But when I began to do research on this Ocean of Churn book, now this is a book which is about the Indian Ocean. So it's a maritime view of the world. And so as part of that research, I decided to go and research Odisha, which, by the way, has a fascinating maritime history. Now, while picking that up, I said, look, something, we almost hear nothing about Odisha in our history books, except one thing, which is that Ashoka went there and beat those chaps up. So I said, what did the Odia think about it? Now, no history book tells you anything about what the Odia way perhaps have thought about it. So that is the point at which I began digging up so many things. And then slowly but steadily, a very different picture of Ashoka emerges. And it's quite interesting because there's actually very little evidence of Ashoka having been a good king. And certainly the evidence, to the extent it exists, suggests that he was a Buddhist well before he invaded Kalinga. The evidence of his regret is quite shaky, incidentally. It is entirely based, by the way, on some inscriptions which are not, interestingly, in Odisha, but far away in what is now Pakistan, where he has said that, I went to Kalinga, I killed all these people, blah, 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 and I'm kind of feeling sorry about the whole matter. But it's quite stunning that none of these regrets happened anywhere near in and around Kalinga. Now, you would think that if he was feeling very regretful, he would at least mention a word of remorse to the people he had carried out. And in fact, he doesn't even offer to free any of the slaves he had captured. So I began to dig further and further into it, and then I discovered that there are several Buddhist texts which mention that, first of all, no Buddhist text connects his conversion to Buddhism to this incident. There are many other incidents, but certainly not this one. So that is one. The second interesting thing is that they all mention...
Chitrakatha made a very plausible story out of it.
That's true.
I can still remember the panels.
The second interesting thing that is there, these Buddhist texts mention that he carried out many other massacres of Jains and Ajivikas, etc., and later in life. And they were not small-scale massacres. There were, there was, I think, one particular incident in which I think 16,000 or some Ajivikas were killed in a single incident in Bengal. Now, I took it quite personally as a Bengali. Now, so there are, several such incidents. And by the way, it fits with now, once you read them and you reread his edicts, then it all makes sense. Because you see, with this, so I went back and looked up the edict in which he had, supposedly showed remorse. So I didn't personally visit this particular place because it's in Pakistan, but at least I read the translation. And so I began reading it, so I read all his remorse and all that. And then I went to the next paragraph. And the very next paragraph, he says, "You forest tribes, if you behave badly, I will do the same thing to you." So I'm sorry.
More of a warning.
So yeah, it was basically a case, I'm feeling a little bit sorry, guys, but I beat those guys up, they really suffered, and I'm feeling a bit bad, but if you feel like you're going to mess with me, you know what's going to happen to you. That's what he's really saying. And by the way, the Odia remember all of this. That is the fascinating bit, because a couple of generations after Ashoka dies and the empire collapses, there is a king of Orissa called Kharavela. And Kharavela is quite interesting. He leaves us an inscription in Hathi Gumfa, just outside Bhubaneswar. So if you go to Bhubaneswar, please see this. And in that he says, I first defeated this king, that king, I threw out the Greeks, etc. Then he said, I went to Pataliputra and made the king of Magad bow to me. And I brought back the Jain idols they had stolen from us. And then he writes this inscription and then he puts up in a hill in front of a cave called Hathi Gumfa. If you walk up that hill, I think it's called Udaygiri or Chandragiri, and you stand in front of this inscription and you just turn around, okay? And if it's a clear day, you see another hill on the other side. And that hill is Dhauli. And guess what is there in Dhauli? That is Ashoka's inscription. So basically what he's saying, you Ashoka, I went to Pataliputra and destroyed your empire. That's what he's saying. It's clear. If you go there, it's just stunning that nobody talks about this. So far from forgiving him, the Odia destroyed his empire and then bragged about it.
No, this is the other passage about Ashoka, which was very interesting, is a Jain devotee was found in Pataliputra drawing a picture showing Buddha bowing to a Jain Tirthankara. Ashoka ordered him and his family to be locked inside their home and for the building to be set alight. He then ordered that he would pay a gold coin in exchange for every decapitated head of a Jain. The carnage only ended when someone mistakenly killed his only surviving brother, the Buddhist monk, with Ashoka. The story suggests frightening parallels with modern-day fundamentalists who kill cartoonists whom they accuse of insulting their religion. Nothing much has changed since the time of Ashoka.
So Ashoka turns out to be more similar to ISIS.
The other feature that comes across in both books is your deep interest in the river Sarasvati. Yes. And your theories about what could have happened to the river. And then, but I'll come to that after you've spoken. Could you elaborate a little on that?
So on the Sarasvati, incidentally, it's not my theories. It's now well established by all reasonable scientists and historians. There's more than adequate archaeological and also space. In fact, you can trace the Sarasvati on Google Maps. So there's more than adequate evidence of where it is. And I'm amazed that nobody debates this, brought up this, why is this even a debate? Because something like 60% of the Harappan sites are along the dry riverbed of this river. It was clearly an important river, and it drained into what is now the Run of Kutch. That is why the Run of Kutch looks like the way it does. If you had gone there 4,000, 5,000 years ago, it would have looked like the Sundarbans. And then the river dried up and climate changed, then it dried up and it left behind those salt flats. So this was the estuary of both, by the way, the Run of Kutch was the estuary of both the Sarasvati and the Indus. The Indus also used to flow into it. So this, by the way, Michel Danino has written about it, but there are lots of scientists and others who have now established.
It's a good book.
It's a good book, but even more research has been done even more recently. And we now know, roughly speaking, that this river was already drying up and dying by the mature period of the Harappans. So when the Harappans were building their biggest cities, the river on which their civilization was based was already drying up. And then 2000 BC, it completely dries up. And of course, climate also changes completely. And it's a devastating event.
And what is very interesting is that you have a passage where you are standing on the banks of the Yamuna in the 21st century looking at what we have done to the river. And then you speculate about whether somebody from the Harappan civilization would have been standing on the banks of the Sarasvati and lamenting over what they had done to the river at that point.
Yes, and in fact, the Rig Veda, there are one or two passages where they vaguely hint at some things that trouble them. And one of the interesting things is passages on Indra. Now, why is Indra an important god in the Rig Veda? So his great act of bravery is quite interesting. Basically, there is a dragon or a demon called Vritra. And what did Vritra do that was so evil? He basically blocked the waters behind stone dams. And so what Indra does is he kills Vritra and he breaks the dams and sets the waters free. And it's repeated. So it's somewhere in the subliminally, clearly something here is going on. Now remember, the Rig Veda, at least according to me, is a very old text. It is pre-mature Harappan. It's probably an early Harappan text. So it predates quite clearly the drying of the Sarasvati. But it may be already suggesting this concern that they are messing around and they may trigger something bad as a result of it. This concern over water was already an issue even in, before the drying up of the Sarasvati.
And I think for us, Tamils, Vritra was clearly a Kannadiga. How would you like history to be perpetuated? In the sense that, a review of your books, it's online, in fact, it says that we should see Sanjeev Sanyal being pitted against the NCERT way of writing books. And we should see what is your take on, how history ought to be taught in schools. For instance, I come from a strong point of view that local history needs to be taught before you go on to talk about world history. But what is your view on
See, I don't have a hierarchy of history in my mind, partly because of my philosophical framework is that it's all related. You can teach local history only in relation to the world, and you can teach world history only in relation. So, for example, if you read my book, if I was teaching history of Chennai with your approach, the way I would do it, I would include, for example, the bombing of Chennai by the Emden. Now, that is a great start-off point for explaining the World War I. So, I think it's I would agree with the idea of mixing and matching. I understand, however, that a textbook by its very nature has to be somewhat a standardized thing, and it has to be simple enough that at multiple layers. It's all very good for people of elite backgrounds, go to good schools where there's good access to teachers. Many of these things are being taught at many places, so where the teacher may not be up to it, and so on. So it has to be, cannot be too complicated. Nevertheless, we can do a few things. One is at least get rid of the biases I mentioned and give a wider view of history, not just that of Delhi. But in the rewriting, I think one important thing we need to do is that we got to also, I think, allow people to look at what the original evidence actually is. And then allow for different interpretations if it's not clear. Look, we can't even decide and agree on what happened last week. Look at any Arnab Goswami show. So why are we all fessed up about historians agreeing on what happened in 3000 BC? Of course we disagree. So the more fun thing is to put the evidence out firstly. Let few reasonable views, although I am not convinced by Lemuria, no matter what you say.
Neither am I.
But put the evidence out, put any reasonable options, but what it will allow you to do is allow you to explore, think of history as an exploration rather than a series of facts that need to be memorized. So it will simply make it more interesting, if nothing else. And I think that would be one thing to do. So this is, so for example, let's take, what was we discussing, Ashoka. if we basically said, look, there was this very powerful, clearly powerful king, and his inscriptions are everywhere. Here is a bunch of his inscriptions, and this is what they say, and seems to have great sentiments in it. Here are two interpretations of it, and ask the child to say, what do you think? And let them come up with their interpretations. Why do we have to insist that this is the only history, this is the only way of thinking about it? If, as I said, if nothing else, it will make it more interesting.
Absolutely. Your view on the Archaeological Survey of India and its role in protecting our historic sites? Because you say you've traveled a lot, and then you gave us this example of this Vijay Stamba in Kolachal, which was a garbage dump till the army.
To be fair, that's not the ASI site, but
I have a running battle on that, but that's a different matter. But the question is, what do you think the ASI has fulfilled its mandate?
So ASI is completely not fulfilling its mandate. To be fair to them, they are also not given very much resources. Given the resources they're given, I forget. It's just ridiculous how little resources they're given. For the amount of debating that happens about our history, I think we spend more newsprint on this issue than on actual archaeology. So this is a serious issue. One is protecting of sites, one is doing, major sites of India related, for example, to Ramayana and Mahabharata and so on, have not been excavated except once, maybe in the 1950s, where B.B. Lal happened to have done it. And then nobody's visited those sites. It's just lying around. Rakhi Gadi hasn't been properly excavated. It is, incidentally, the largest Harappan site, and nobody's excavated. And there are things just piling up, lying around everywhere. And as a result of all of this, forget that stuff is getting destroyed. So something like 10,000 pieces of Indian sculpture and art have been stolen in the last 30, 40 years, worth perhaps as much as $10 billion. I'm helping a small group to try and retrieve some of this, but the ASI simply doesn't have a chance. These are organized groups with all kinds of things. So I think
is the Vijay Kumar.
Yes, the India Pride project, based out of Singapore. My friend Vijay Kumar runs it. I have a small role to play in it as well. But the point is, these are private individuals doing it, and I think this is a particularly interesting point to bring out. If you unless you have a country that is genuinely interested in its history, you cannot have resources for this. Sadly, we think that protecting archaeological sites is some sort of an elitist project. This is embedded in our thinking process. So you will spend tens of thousands of rupees, tens of thousands of crores of rupees on all kinds of projects. But a lot of questions will be raised if you want to spend it on conservation. Even though you're probably going to make back that money on tourism. So I think in the end, rather than blame ASI for all its faults, we have to have a discussion about India as a country, and have a discussion about our own interest in our history, and a serious one, rather than this political point scoring kind of history debates.
What do you think about colonial history, conservation of colonial history remnants? Because in Chennai we have a running battle where much of the buildings that were built during that era, the government is not bothered with it, and when it falls, the general attitude is, though it was built by the British, we don't need to maintain them any longer. What is your view about that?
See, it may not be possible to protect every single building just because it's old, but certainly the important buildings, even of the colonial period, need to be protected. They are a part of Indian history. The Victoria Memorial is a pretty nice building, and I think it's a symbol of Kolkata, and it should be preserved. It's a part of that city. In any case, why pick out British colonialism? We can also pick out Turco-Mongol colonialism and say, okay, let's now demolish the Taj Mahal. So there is no end to this. So the fact is that there is lots of colonial buildings which are actually very beautiful. And incidentally, I keep making the point that Kolkata, incidentally, has the largest collection of extant Victorian buildings in the world. The ones you see in London are recreations because they're all bombed to the ground in the Second World War. Kolkata is it. If you just rebuild and paint those buildings, Kolkata can just function on tourism. So, yeah, I think good buildings from any era need to be protected and looked after.
Thank you for that, and I hope it gets reported in the papers tomorrow. But we'll see what impact it has over here. The you know the other role that you've played is that of an urbanist, and you've been talking about walkability in Indian cities particularly. Would you like to elaborate on that? Because I think that is such an issue today in the way we live and the way we go around our cities. So can you talk about that?
Yes, in fact, I am currently attempting to write a new urban policy for India, and I'm specifically adding the word walkability there fairly prominently. The reason for that is very simple. The human interaction with any city is on foot. That's a natural way of doing it. A lot of discussion happens about public transport, which everybody talks about, but the fact is, the first mile and last mile of every form of public transport is about walking. So unless you're fixed walking, forget public transport. There is a waste of time having a discussion about this. And so walking is very, very critical, but it also allows us to think of cities in very radically different ways. And since we are in a history session, let me tell you, I usually try to irritate votaries of Chandigarh by telling them actually that Varanasi is a vastly better city.
Because everybody walks around.
Because you see, it's only a problem if you're trying to drive a car through those lanes. If you walk around in Varanasi, it's a perfectly nice place. How does it matter if the lane is going left, then right, then left? That the car has a problem with that. I don't have a problem with that. The problem with Varanasi is not the design problem, it's a management problem. The lanes are dirty. That is the problem. So if you clean those lanes up, after all, we all go to European cities and wander around the same medieval roads, and they all celebrate, and we pay 300 euros a night to live in those kinds of lanes. Whereas in fact, Varanasi lanes are more beautiful, they are older. In some cases, they preserve the original uses. And so my own view is that we need to rethink our cities, and walking is a very important way to simply rethink the paradigm of how we think about a city.
Where are the next books coming from? What are the ideas?
Okay, the very next book is not history, or maybe one day we consider it history, but right now it isn't. It's satire. I live in Delhi, so there's lots to be satirical about. It's a satire on modern India, and so it's got stories on Bengali intellectuals, NGO aunties of India Habitat Center, bureaucrats, NRIs who come back for 2 weeks a year and tell us how to improve us.
Of course. Yes.
So all of them are there in the book. Then immediately after that, it's not a new book in the sense, it's a collection of my articles. But the book I'm going to research over the next couple of years, and I'll do it at leisure, is a book about the rethinking and retelling the story of India's freedom movement from the perspective of the revolutionaries. And I think there is an interesting story to be told there, partly because, of course, it comes partly from my own family history, which is heavily intertwined with the revolutionary movement, but it gives you a very different flavor of the Indian freedom movement. The conventional views firstly have largely brushed the revolutionaries under the carpet, and the impression you get is that, yeah, occasionally there were these rather misguided but brave individuals who carried out these completely random acts of violence, but by and large it had no impact on the overall story. That could not be any further from the truth. The revolutionaries, starting from around about 1905 or thereabouts, were actually a fairly large movement. Bengal was one big hub, so were their major hub in Punjab, and there were other hubs. Maharashtra was another. Southern India was not very much into it, but much of the rest of India was. And and they were organized. And in the First World War, they actually had embassies in places like Berlin. And they had networks all over the world. Only when you begin to understand these networks that you begin to understand the Gadar movement. You begin to understand for example, how Singapore was actually captured in 1915 by a renegade Indian regiment, which was then defeated and they were all shot dead. That's when you begin to understand why you had the Rowlatt Act and Jallianwala Bagh massacre. That's when you begin to piece it together. It looks like a very different history. And these are organized people, organized around the world, with international linkages with governments, with a fairly complex back and forth. And you have people like Raj Bihari Bose based in Japan, who, by the way, is almost entirely forgotten in India. But in fact, seen from a revolutionary perspective, he is, if anything, more important than Gandhi. So there is a completely different view, which then, and throughout this story, what are they trying to do? They are trying to instigate a major revolt in the Indian armed forces. That is what they're really trying to do. So all the other things they do, are basically peripheral to this one thing that they're trying to do, is instigate a revolt in the Indian army. And they don't succeed in the First World War with the Gadar and other things. Then in the Second World War, they sort of succeed with INA.
The naval rating mutiny also, I suppose.
Yes, and it then ultimately culminates in the naval ratings mutiny. And this is important because that ratings mutiny, from the revolutionary perspective, they would argue that is what triggers independence. That is the point where the British realize they cannot control India anymore. And by the way, I'm not the first person to have come up with this idea. There are many people, contemporaries of that time, who took that same view, including, incidentally, Ambedkar, who has there on a BBC interview where he makes the point that the naval mutiny was the thing that led to Indian freedom and nothing to do with making salt.
Trust Ambedkar to come up with that statement. Very interesting. I think we'll now throw it open to questions. Remember the usual rules, no personal reminiscences. Questions, please. So we'll start with Mr. Tyagarajan.
Should we give
There is a mic here.
We can pass that around. Yeah, then others can also hear.
Yeah.
Are you an RSS pracharak?
No. Answer is no.
True, the other thing is quite simple. What is the difference between a principal economic advisor and the chief economic advisor?
We haven't quite worked it out. But let's say we have sort of similar remits, but he is more senior than I am. And while it isn't quite defined what the difference is, but I work on slightly more financial markets, G20 kind of areas. I don't, unlike him, work on fiscal type things so much. So we have, but it's not a hard and fast. I mean, some future principal economic advisor and chief economic advisor may divide up things differently.
Would you agree with some of the points in history which you are making from a different perspective? Does it not tend towards the present government's thinking of that?
Yeah, it may well do so. I am a member of the present government. Okay. So, but these books were written long before the government came to power. But the point is, yes, I do have that, and my view is, why not? The question is, what is the evidence I'm presenting, and is my interpretation of it reasonable? My view too should be accepted and things. So every historian has a right to his opinion and interpretation. He does not have a right to his own facts. Unfortunately, much of the existing textbooks either are based on non-existent facts or on completely outdated facts. And by the way, I do not consider my facts as static. So new facts will keep coming out, and I will adjust to it. So one example which we discussed was my view on Ashoka. I did not start out with a preconceived notion that he was a bad guy. I have evolved to that because I saw evidence to that.
Was Rama born in Ayodhya?
I don't know, I haven't seen his birth certificate, but it is a belief, and if it's a matter of belief, that's a different issue. But as a historian, I can't.
Your comment on the non-fact-based history books reminds me very much of Carnatic music history, which is largely, all the books written in it are normally largely non-fact-based stories. So we have a long history going.
Maybe there's a history of the history writing.
That's right. There should be. Yeah.
Just I want to continue his question. As I wanted to, in the course of your featured excavations about Ramayana and Mahabharata is to be done. So is it here an epic or you believe that had happened?
So first of all, what one has to stop confusing the geographical and archaeological sites with the events. It is true that many of the places mentioned in the epics do happen to be archaeological sites, and there are Iron Age sites there. I mean, one happens to be even in Delhi. The Purana Killa does have a very, very old Iron Age site there, going back at least to 600 BC. And who knows, one can, there are some shards and pieces that may be even older. Varanasi, for example, now the latest evidence is that maybe as old as 2000 BC. And maybe even contemporaneous to Harappa. So these sites are in existence. Hastinapur, for example, there is a place near Meerut. There is a site, you can dig it up, there are Iron Age things there. Now, that is not to be confused with whether the events in it happened or not, which is a different thing. None of these places, the evidence existing today, can prove that the events happened or not. And of course, if you go to Kurukshetra and we dig it up and we find that there's lots of arrows and swords lying around in the ground, maybe then that is, so but nobody has found it. So I am always based on what is the evidence. The evidence is that Valmiki similarly was probably talking about real places. So if you go to Kishkinda, for example, which is right across the Tungabhadra from Hampi, it's a real place. If you go there, it's extraordinary. The description in the Valmiki Ramayana is exactly the same. It basically describes a rocky place. There are lots of monkeys. There, by the way, is a bear sanctuary right next door. If you're thinking about Jambawan, there, the description of the Pampa is it's very similar looking place with it has lotuses and the same kind. So it's obviously a description of that place. Now, does that mean that there was some person called Rama who went there and saw it? I have no way of knowing. But what we can say that whoever was writing these epics was writing about real places. Now, even if I am writing a piece of fiction, I will very often write about real places. My next book is a piece of satire. It's fiction, but it is about Bombay, Calcutta, Delhi. So it describes those places. So it is entirely possible that there is some part of it, there is some deep factual events there, but none of the evidence that exists today can prove it. But you can say reasonably that these places that they are talking about were real places. That I think there is reasonable evidence to say.
You, passingly in your conversation, you said that in South there was no mutiny in case of
revolutionary.
This Vellore mutiny was the first of its kind even in India in that respect. I do not know.
No, but that is not what I am talking about. The revolutionary movement is this is what I am trying to breaking away from. Generic statements about some act of war or armed revolt is not the revolutionary movement. The revolutionary movement is a well-organized movement which is a well-defined movement. It's just like there was a Gandhian movement in National Congress. It's a well-defined movement. Just because somebody happened to go on a fast does not mean he became a member of the Congress or that he became a Gandhian, right? In the same way, just because somebody carried out an act of revolt does not mean I'm talking. So a revolutionary movement is a very, very defined movement. And that is in fact the point I'm making. Now, in fact, in the afternoon, I had a discussion about this. That seems odd that there is no documentation of it. Now, it's entirely possible that such a movement did exist, and as I research it, I may discover it. By the way, I'm open-minded to the fact that something like this did happen. But do not confuse it with the Vellore mutiny, which is a totally unconnected event, not unconnected to the independence movement, but it is unconnected to the specific revolutionary movement that I am trying to describe, which goes back to Aurobindo, Bhagat Singh, Satyendra Sanyal, Raj Bihari Bose, in the very initial stages also Veer Savarkar and so on. So that is a very well-defined movement that I am quite certain they had some groups in southern India, but
Ravesu Iyer was definitely a part of that group.
Yeah.
And his life is worthy of inclusion
so,
as a revolutionary.
So I may begin. So I may begin to collect material. And by the way, I also need to do with women revolutionaries. There were women revolutionaries,
Right.
but they're also very, very poorly documented. So I will put in an extra effort to dig these things out. So as things stand, I haven't found enough evidence on southern India, but I have found on women lots of evidence. And maybe this gentleman you just mentioned, maybe sometimes you take one person and then begin to make the dots, and then you peel away and you find. So it's quite possible that if I come back a couple of years from now, I will begin to
Neelakanta Brahmachari again, and then Vanchinathan, who shot, they were all part of a revolutionary gang that was near the Tirunelveli area.
Okay.
So definitely they were a revolutionary network. H.D. Raja in Madras, for instance, and later lived in Bombay and came back to Madras. So these were all people who were part of a revolutionary.
So I need to connect the dots. So I haven't done it yet. It's a work in progress.
Before we go to the next question, please remember one question per person, because then we'll be able to send the mic around and ask questions. Yes, please.
The running battles on Indian history at the national level is between genuine historians and the eminent historians. The growing battle also is now from the non-Indians. So how do we handle the world's view on Indian history, given that you have distinguished between history, the need to be explorative than fact-based, whereas the world's view has been more on fact-based. So how do we handle the world's view on Indian history?
See, the eminent historians largely base their eminence on one very simple fact, that nobody challenges them. Nobody writes the alternative histories. All that you really get is rants on social media. So there is very little alternative history being written. And to be very frank, when I began giving alternative stories, I have actually been to JNU at the height of year before last agitation with Kanhaiya or whatever, where people trying to beat the hell each other out. In the middle of that, I gave a lecture with my own view of history, which is clearly not the JNU version of history. I had a packed audience like this, and I had no problem. So the point is, the large part of the mainstream historians' eminence is largely based on the laziness of other people not putting together a proper narrative as an alternative based on fact, not on rhetoric. So this is that is what is necessary, and you need to keep updating it. If you start out with the view that this is the history I'm going to tell, then you're going to lie about the history, about your evidence very quickly. If you, on the other hand, collect the evidence, put it there, and say a story that is your interpretation, people more or less accept it as long as you do a reasonable, honest job of it.
Very
and you mentioned about world history. Second part about world history as well. But yeah, world's view on Indian history ultimately will come from what we say. Look, if we don't have a view of our own history, why blame other people?
Nagraj.
Coming to Ramayana, this again and again talking about this Ramar Setu. Even today, the government has given an answer to the Supreme Court saying that it will affect the sentiments of the people, so it's not better that you open the subject. What is your view on that?
First of all, my reason for preserving Rama Setu is a very simple one. Two things. One is it's clearly an interesting feature, man-made or geological, you can debate forever. It is certainly very, very fascinating that there is this long sandbar which is ecologically sensitive, which connects the southern tip of India to the northern tip of Sri Lanka. Now, whatever reason it exists, it is an extraordinary place. It is ecologically sensitive, reefs and all kinds of wild marine life there. It needs to be preserved irrespective of any other thing, number one. Number two, faith is faith. And unless there is a particularly great reason for destroying it, why not preserve it? I mean, people, after all, nobody is going and questioning, is the black stone in Kaaba really, truly sent by God or not? So, if people believe it and it's not getting in anyone's way, what's the problem? And it turns out, as a third point, as an economist, let me tell you, it's a bad idea anyway, because you'll have to spend so much on dredging, it won't be worth the trouble. So it's an economically unviable, ecologically unviable, and is a culturally untenable idea. Why bother? And there is a simple way of getting around it, incidentally, by just going slightly north, because that Rameshwaram is an island. You can just go around it. There is happens to be a train line which can be put underwater or above water, whatever, and you can go under it if you wish.
And we've been doing it for years.
You're doing it
Not
for
as
years.
though we need it. Personally.
You can challenge on economic aspect, but not on the spiritual.
Why not? Why not? If people believe it is, so believe it is. So what's the no? So point of the matter is, it is getting in your way. You may not believe, somebody else believes. That's okay.
It comes as an obstacle for development.
No, that's the point of making. It's not getting in anyone's development.
Can I make next question? You have paid rich tribute about the contribution of Marthandam.
Where? Sorry, where are you?
No, he's right there.
Tributes about the valor of the kings of Kerala and the Battle of Asai and other things. What's your take on inclusion of military history also as a part for the curriculum in the schools and colleges?
Yeah, you can. As it happens to be, we do have lots of military history in our books. We always lose in them.
That's what I'm saying.
So we can have, I mean, you can have, if you like more battles, I am always in favor of lots more battles being included in history, with lots of blood and gore. But the point of the matter is, yeah, sure. But the point is, let us include all these interesting things. And by the way, history is not just about what is taught in schools. That is just one part of it. We need more history writing generally for readings, just for fun to read. I mean, and not just books. You can also have genuine good documentaries, movies. Like let's take 1971 war. Okay, India won an extraordinary war against Pakistan under very difficult circumstances, where the leading major power, America, was definitely threatening us, and in the face of a major genocide in which 3 million Bengalis died. Right? It was a horrible, horrible event. Now think of the number of movies that have been made on the Second World War and about Jewish genocide. And how many movies have we Indians made? Never mind, Pakistanis are not making it, I understand. But why aren't we making any? How many books have you read written by Indians on the genocide of Bengalis in East Pakistan? They're not trivial number, 3 million killed. 10 million of them came as refugees into India.
I happen to take part in that.
Yeah, so please write a book about it. Where are the popular books about it? Where is the popular movies about it? You know, in December every year, there will be 3 tweets, which everybody will retweet, which will have a photograph of the signing of surrender. That's it.
General
Niazi and Major General Arora, right?
Arora. Jagjit Singh Arora.
Jagjit, yeah. So there will be that photograph. Somebody called History in Pics, or somebody will tweet, and every one of you will retweet it, and then say that's now history is done. Now let's get back to fighting about some completely other thing. Yes, please.
Thank you, Sanjeev, for a fantastic and inspiring talk. I'd like to understand your view on the standard of evidence which is demanded out of a narrative that is relative, that is specific to, let's say, Bharat or India, vis-a-vis the standard of evidence that is normally needed for, let's say, Greek historicity, right? I heard this point right now about the worldview of India being quote-unquote fact-based, right? Now, I'd love, since you have researched before Common Era, maybe with an example of, let's say, Pythagoras or any other example, could you illustrate the difference? The point that
So the point is true, and I write about it in my book, Ocean of Churn, that for a variety of reasons, the British, when they were writing about India, they always placed Indian evidence as being of lower quality, and they've drilled it inside our heads also. But if you go and look at their own history, it is based on no more. I mean, the Venerable Bede wasn't any greater a source of history. And I've looked through some of the Chinese texts also. They are full of mythology and all kinds of other things. And by the way, Herodotus, the great, not philosopher, he's a historian and suppose the father of history, And much of European history begins with quoting Herodotus. Herodotus has all kinds of absurd things in his book, and it's particularly relating to Indians, where he talks about how Indians were mining gold using gigantic ants. And that if you had to go at midday and dig it up, and then if you have to be careful because these ants may come chasing you and you'd eat you alive. And all kinds of wacko stories, right? Now, why is Herodotus then not thrown into a trash can? Because he has all these other things. When as in fact, Raja Tarangini by Kalhana is actually far more accurate. And by the way, there are many, and many people will say, oh, but that is the only history book. That's not at all true. In fact, Kalhana himself mentions that there are other historians. And there are many such evidence all over the place.
Even the Megha Sandesham of Kalidasa is so accurate when it comes to its geographical descriptions of what.
Yeah, but at least you can say that it is literary.
Yeah.
But there are inscriptions and all kinds of things. After all, we are willing to recreate Egyptian history or even European history based on the edicts and things that are there on the tombs. Why can't we do it through our own inscriptions? Well, why? Sure, you should take our inscriptions with a pinch of salt. So should we take their inscriptions with a pinch of salt? So that's one. Secondly, we give huge credence to foreign visitors who happen to be coming to India and having written about India, as if Xuanzang or Fahian and all these guys, and so they must be true because they were foreigners came. Now that I understand why the Europeans, the British liked this because they were themselves foreigners and therefore liked to see these people as their sort of precursors, and therefore. But if you actually read them, and please read them and you'll see it for yourself, they have their own biases. For example, Xuanzang is clearly biased about anybody who is not Buddhist. So he goes to Kashmir and he gets mugged by some bandits, and his clothes and everything are taken away. So the local Brahmins take him in, they feed him, they give him clothes and all of that. When he has done all of that, then when he's recovered, he gets up and gives them a long lecture on how their philosophical systems were all wrong and they are actually non-believers. Now he was a complete fanatic, and it's also interesting that no Indian Buddhists would have done it, because they are born in the Indic thing. Such a behavior of calling somebody a non-believer is clearly not what Indian Buddhism would have done. This was a foreign idea, a foreign Buddhism that was coming back and imposing on us a certain worldview. Now, we read his books as being the source of information. We have to adjust for his somewhat siloed worldview. Similarly, you have Ibn Battuta. Ibn Battuta comes to India and he always mentions that whenever he goes somewhere, he's making his way from Delhi to Gujarat and then ultimately to Kerala, and he gets attacked along the way. And he always calls the Indians bandits. But why should we call them bandits? The kingdom was then under Mughal, Tughlaq occupation. Tughlaq were Turkic and very cruel, violent rulers. The fellows who were fighting back against the Tughlaqs were not to be. Why should we see them as bandits? They were freedom fighters.
Very similar people, but the streets are clean and people follow the law. And I've been searching in history for answers of why are we so different as a people? Am I looking in the wrong place, or?
No, firstly tells you that when Odia and Bengali people go abroad, they behave well. Now, you're absolutely right that it is an organized, much more organized society, culturally very, very, very close to us. And so, nothing that they do is not possible in India. Indians also, why this thing? The same Indians goes to Singapore and behaves perfectly well. And then he'll fly back to India. Moment he'll come out of the airport, get into his car and drive like a lunatic. I can tell you this happens because I do it also. So, a lot of it depends on context. And so, changing our self-image, it is not okay ki chalta hai. We can improve this place. There is nothing inherently backward about us. Is a very important part of something inside our head. One guy sets up one academy for teaching badminton in Hyderabad. And all of a sudden, we are able to compete not in the world. We are now, there are more Indians in the top 100 of badminton, both men's and women's, than there are Chinese. So one guy put in the effort and did it, and he spoke here. There you go. And yet, just 20 years ago, I remember growing up. Why aren't Indians good in sport? Oh, because we do not eat some kinds of meat. Because we are genetically not good enough. Our weather is too hot. All kinds of nonsensical reasons. Every reason other than the fact that you need systematic coaching. And so this is what it is. It's in our head. If we set ourselves to it, we can do it. If we can get to the moon, we can have some clean roads as well.
What's your view on, as a historian, on Padmavati? There's so much controversy.
You remember I had this question and then we...
And is some kind of rewriting of history going to cause problems?
So the point here is, okay, so let's separate the movie issue first, because I have some views on that as well, and they are publicly available. I was tweeting about it during the controversy. So let's keep that away. Now, Padmavati, the story that we have today, is taken from a epic written by Jayasi. Okay, that epic exists. Now, whether the specific events of that epic are particularly true is not clear. However, it is a fact that Alauddin Khilji sacked Chittor. It is a fact that all the men fought to the last man and were killed, and all the women and children, both male and female, burned themselves to death. These are facts, incontrovertible, with lots of evidence for it. So Jayasi may have taken that story and built up the story about this queen to give it some characters, but the fact of Jauhar, the fact of the sacking and so on is very well documented. So that there is no historical argument about that. So I think most of the historicity debate is about whether or not Padmavati existed. Maybe she did, maybe she didn't. But the horror of that episode is absolutely real. Now, as far as this movie episode is concerned, I think it was an astonishing case of a group of people hijacking an issue without having even watched the movie. Because the irony of the situation is, having watched the movie myself, is that the one group of people it did not insult was the Rajputs. So, so one of the things we must learn from our own history, particularly Rajput history, is that never charge in without doing your intelligence work first.
I'd just like to read out the little passage that he has on Alauddin Khilji, because it gives a slightly different perspective. Alauddin Khilji built a large reservoir called the House Khas. It still exists and is surrounded by a beautiful park, a wonderful place to go for a walk on a sunny winter afternoon. Overlooking the water body are the remains of an old madrasa built by a later sultan and the urban village of House Khas. Since the 1990s, this village has transformed itself into a warren of expensive boutiques and trendy bars. This is ironic because Alauddin was a severe man who strictly controlled the prices of all goods and forbade the consumption and sale of alcohol.
It is the revenge of history.
Interestingly, while we are talking about this Chittorgarh Jauhar, what is forgotten that is in Tanjavur there was an instance of it in 1673, when the Madurai Nayak waged a war on the Tanjavur Nayak because he wanted to marry the Tanjavur Nayak's daughter. Both were Hindu kings. And Raghunatha, Vijay Raghunatha, the last king of Tanjavur Nayak, when he goes out, he instructs the queens to blow themselves up the moment the news of his death in the battlefield is known. He is decapitated and all 600 queens and concubines blow themselves up and die in the explosion. So this has happened in Tanjavur. But not a soul talks about it all the time. We talk about Padmini, and this is a fact.
No, there were many Jauhar. Padmini is written, you see, as I said, very often, literature very often creates the image of the event. So, I think in some ways, the story of Padmini is important even from a history perspective. Because whether or not the specific character of Padmini existed, which I have no way of knowing, the event itself is remembered because of this poem. And I think in some ways that is an important part of remembering. Like for example, if you take Prithviraj Chauhan, it's remembered because of that poem Prithviraj Raso, and it's not entirely historical.
And Bardai brings himself into
See, all kinds of things happen in it. But I think in some ways it is important to, some way going back to your earlier point, did the events of the Ramayana and Mahabharata happen? Well, maybe something happened. There was a great war of some kind in very ancient times, and it was maybe many, many centuries later remembered and exaggerated and added on to and then rewritten. And so while we shouldn't be getting too excited about the exact events or whether Krishna exactly said this and Arjuna exactly said that, it does tell us some interesting things about the social mores of that time, the worldview of that time, the geographical knowledge, perhaps a little bit about the cities, taking it with a pinch of salt, but nevertheless giving us some sense. And by the way, that I want to, and I was discussing this earlier with you, I think we need to mine the Sangam literature much more sensibly for this. Unfortunately, it has been captured by a certain line of thinking and has been unnecessarily wasted, whereas there is actually interesting things to be said about Sangam literature and linking it to actual archaeological site. I believe near Madurai a few sites are, and that also has gone into some random controversy. There's no need for it. Let's dig the place up and see what is there, and let's see if it fits with the facts. Some will, some won't. It's all right. That's what they are. That's what the facts are, and get on with it.
Certain.
As a man who's so passionate about Sangam poetry and literature, would you like to say something? You don't want to.
I have a totally different question. You know, the history is often told to everybody, Indians and foreigners, when you visit touristy places. And the guides have their own interpretation of what the history is all about. Very often horribly embellished and very false and very dramatic. The thing that drives this kind of thing is total apathy, in my mind, of the Government of India and Tourism Department, who are very ill-funded, like the Archaeological Society. So the propagation of history itself in India is given to people who don't understand history or have very little reverence for history. The Indian government, which controls the tourism department, is also very apathetic about tourism, because you go to say England, there's so much of hoo-ha is made about so and so ate breakfast in this restaurant.
Yeah, but okay. So let me answer your question. First of all, they are also storytelling. Our fellows are only storytelling. So our storytelling is not as sophisticated, but it's still theirs is also storytelling. Let's be clear. When you go and see that rather small set of walls called the Tower of London, and there are a few fellows with called beefeaters with some fancy red thing. They're also storytelling about ghosts and so on. And frankly, since it's all evidence based and I haven't seen the evidence of the ghosts, I am rather skeptical about them. So the point is, storytelling is part of the tourism industry. We have got to go with the flow. So let's not confuse the storytelling bit of it. What is important is that that at least the clear facts, those who consider themselves interested in the history part of it, do collect the facts and put it out for those who are interested in. There are plaques put out there that accept. Problem is, when you go to a historical site, for most part, you'll find a big board, and the board will say, trespassers will be prosecuted under something, you must do this, you will be, all kinds of long rules, none of which are followed, but nothing about the place itself. So I think some degree of that, with the guides and their storytelling, I don't think we should interfere with. That is part of that is also part of the ecosystem of the place.
I think Jayasri must have been a guide in his time.
I may have been. So I'm not too unhappy about the storytelling part of it, because the rest of the world is also making it after. We are only going there appreciating this and that in Europe. We should also take their history with a punch.
Well, that was a minor part of it. The major part was the apathy with which tourism is treated.
No, this I fully agree with you. I mean, the apathy is just shocking. I mean, some of the places that we have just allowed to go to rot, even in major cities, is just pathetic. And the same fellows will spend resources to go, and the hypocrisy of it is even better. For example, there's a live case I'll tell you about. There's currently, there is a horse cast village that was there, and next to it is this horse cast archaeological site. And because it's next to an archaeological site, now there's a big dispute, and they're going to have to shut down half of the village and the bars and restaurants there. Now, it happens to be because of the bars and restaurants, a lot of people used to come to it and used to go to that archaeological site, which is in no way getting in the way of the archaeological site. In fact, that archaeological site was a disaster in my childhood and has been rebuilt because of new interest that has been generated because of new people coming there. And yet there is now a court case because of which they will now stop Horsecast village as an economic hub. Now what will happen? It is not that the archaeological site is going to be better. Instead, what will happen? People will stop going there. Now there are few hundred and thousands of archaeological sites of similar value and importance in Delhi. They are all falling apart. Neither the Supreme Court nor ASI nor anybody is interested in looking after those. They can clearly go and do that. Instead, they are more interested in stopping commercial activity happening just because it's not within the so many yards of the place, which is not in any way interfering with, in my view at least, with the archaeological site. So this kind of hypocrisy is what the problem is. You see, we confuse so-called preservation. It basically is more about turf control. It's nothing to do with preservation at all.
Time for just one last question. Yes, please.
Yeah, coming back to the revolutionary movement, well, the names that you mentioned and the ones that we know primarily belong to Hindus and the Sikhs, whereas there were other communities equally oppressed by the British, predominantly the Muslims, who were about 1/3. Why is it that they stayed away from it, or is it that we don't know enough about them, or something else was happening? It becomes particularly pertinent that they were politically present in Indian National Congress and other parties opposing the British.
So it is not the case that there were none. There were people like Ashfaqullah Khan, for example, who were a part of the Hindustan Republican Army and were together with Bhagat Singh, and Ashfaqullah, I think, was hanged for the Kakodi case, if I'm not mistaken. So there were some Muslims, but yes, you are right that it is predominantly a Bengali Hindu, Punjabi Hindu Sikh movement with sprinkling of people from other places, including UP and Maharashtra and so on. So it does have that streak, and part of the reason, of course, is that the revolutionaries, till at least the 1930s, were heavily dominated by ideas of the Shakti movement, by the way.
Kali worship.
Kali worship was a very important part. In fact, the Vande Mataram song is really their chant rather than that of the Congress. It is very much linked to the idea of India as a goddess. So there is indeed a strong streak of Hindu nationalism that was there in the revolutionary movement, the one that I am describing particularly. And so that element was there. But I think the Muslim revolt, so to speak, tended to happen a somewhat different way. For example, the Mopla revolt in Kerala. It happened in a totally different way. They were revolt and it was violent, but it was a very different episode. Whereas the revolutionary movement that I am talking about, the long range organized revolutionary movement as opposed to sporadic events, that was indeed dominated by Hindus till well into the 1930s. Then the communists took it over in the 1930s.
Do we have time
Yeah.
for one more question?
We'll have to.
The book you mentioned about you will know RRA, you will know RRA, what about you will know RRA, the book, Homo sapiens,
Okay.
There you are.
The quote about history, who will know RRA is like to read the past information, to read the past information, to understand the present better, and to make the future better. But the perspective looking at the book was a change, that the economical cultural perspective is missing. Then how the social, cultural, economic change the impact now the contemporary world is missing.
See, there are many books. If you prefer that kind of thing, the Land of Seven Rivers has more of that. That book is a very simple thing. It's a maritime history of the Indian Ocean. And it does mention certain cultural issues. Yes, I do talk quite a lot about the exchange of culture between India and Southeast Asia and so on. Yeah, so it does talk about trade. I mean, much of it is about voyages.
In fact, there's a whole chapter on the merchants and things like that. So there is
and it talks a lot about how the temples were banks and all kinds of things.
Yeah, that's very much.
It's very much there. Maybe, I mean, it's a book of 300 words. I can only write that much. And it has 20 pages of references. You are very welcome to go and chase.
I think we should take that after the meeting.
So why don't you write one?
Sanjeev, I just want to thank you. And I think a lot of topics and questions came up about textbooks in schools. So I want to share that I manage a school here in Chennai. I know what the NCERT has given for the school, but nothing has prevented me from reading up further. So my students are reading Sanjeev's books, extra books. What's important is that they're learning to think. I want them to be exposed to more materials and form their own conclusions. So as a private school, it's wonderful. No one prevents us from not reading up further. Of course, if the mandate comes from the NCERT, it's wonderful. I think no one is preventing us from actually wanting to explore further. That's all I want.
Thank you. Thank you.
So, one last question. The time.
History made interesting. That's exactly how I'd like to sum up this session. Thank you very much, Sanjeev Sanyal and V. Sriram. Thank you very much for a very insightful session. And thank you all for making such an amazing audience. We have our patrons amidst us today, Mr. Suresh Krishna and Mr. M.V. Subbaya. Thank you very much for joining us today. We'd also like to thank Madras School of Economics, the student volunteers here, Asian School of Journalism for helping us with the live tweeting. And I'd also like to remind you of the upcoming events. We have a series of programs coming up starting March 30th. Mr. Rajiv Malhotra, and then April 2nd we have a water conservation program that's supposed to be, that promises to be very interesting as well. And then we have an event by Ashwin Sanghi. So we'll send you mailers about all those events. Kindly do follow us on Twitter, CIC_Chennai is our Twitter handle. And we hope to see you again during all our events. Thank you and have a good night.